They were ready for your reaction. They had already written the script in their mind. You would panic when they pulled away. You would send multiple texts asking what was wrong. You would chase them with increasing desperation as the silence stretched. You would eventually break down and beg for another chance, for clarity, for anything to end the uncertainty. The avoidant had seen this pattern play out countless times before. They knew how people responded to their withdrawal. They understood the power dynamics of distance and pursuit. They were confident in their ability to control the situation by simply disappearing and waiting for you to crack under the pressure of their absence. But then something happened that shattered their entire framework. You went silent. Not the silent treatment designed to manipulate them back. Not the wounded silence that screams for attention. Not the strategic silence calculated to make them miss you. You went genuinely, authentically, completely silent, and the avoidant is now experiencing a psychological crisis they never saw coming. The avoidant's entire relationship strategy is built on a predictable pattern. They create distance, the other person pursues, they get to feel desired without being vulnerable, and the cycle repeats until they decide whether to let the person back in or discard them entirely. This pattern gives them control. It allows them to regulate intimacy on their terms. It prevents them from ever having to face the discomfort of being the one who cares more, needs more, wants more. They've perfected this dance over years, maybe decades. Every relationship follows the same choreography. They pull away, the other person chases. They feel powerful and desired. They return when they're ready, and the other person is so relieved they don't demand accountability. But you broke the pattern. When they pulled away this time, expecting the usual pursuit, they were met with nothing. No desperate texts, no confused phone calls, no attempts to understand what went wrong, no begging for them to come back, just silence, pure, unbroken, absolute silence. At first, the avoidant probably felt relieved. Finally, they thought, someone who understands space, someone who isn't clingy or needy, someone who can handle their independence. But as hours turned into days, and days stretched toward weeks, something shifted. The relief transformed into confusion. The confusion morphed into concern. And the concern is rapidly becoming something the avoidant rarely experiences, genuine panic. Your silence has disrupted every assumption the avoidant held about you, about the relationship, about their own power and desirability. They thought they knew who you were. They thought they had you figured out. They believed you were someone who would fight for them, pursue them, prove your worth to them. Your silence is forcing them to confront the possibility that they were wrong about everything. Maybe you weren't as invested as they thought. Maybe you didn't care as much as their ego assumed. Maybe they weren't as important to you as you were becoming to them. These thoughts are creating cognitive dissonance that the avoidance mind is struggling to reconcile, the shock of your absence. The first emotion the avoidant experiences when you go silent is shock. They genuinely did not see this coming. In their mind, the relationship followed a certain script, and your behavior has deviated from that script so dramatically that they don't know how to process it. The avoidant was prepared for anger, for hurt, for attempts to manipulate them into reconnecting. They were ready to handle your emotional reaction with their usual detachment and control. But your silence isn't an emotional reaction they can manage. It's an absence they can't control. An absence is the one thing the avoidant has no strategy for handling. The shock intensifies because your silence communicates something the avoidant never expected: indifference. Not the fake indifference they perform to protect themselves, but what appears to be genuine lack of concern about their withdrawal. This reading might be completely inaccurate. Your silence might be the result of deep hurt, intentional boundary setting, or exhaustion with their patterns. But to the avoidant, it looks like you simply don't care. And if you don't care, that means they don't matter. And if they don't matter, their entire sense of self, which is partially built on being the desired one, the one others pursue, begins to crumble. The avoidant starts questioning everything. Did they misread how you felt about them? Were you ever actually that interested, or were they projecting? Was the connection real, or did they create it in their imagination? These questions assault them because the avoidant, despite their dismissive exterior, is often deeply insecure about their lovability. They act like they don't need anyone precisely because they're terrified of needing someone and being rejected. Your silence triggers every abandonment wound they've spent their life pretending doesn't exist. The shock also comes from the loss of control. The avoidant is used to dictating the terms of connection and disconnection. They decide when to pull away and when to come back. They control the rhythm of the relationship. Your silence has wrested that control from their hands. Now you're the one determining the terms. You're the one creating distance. You're the one who apparently doesn't need them. This power reversal is so disorienting that the avoidant doesn't know how to respond. All their usual strategies are designed for pursuit, not for absence. They don't have a playbook for what to do when someone simply stops engaging. The interpretation crisis. As your silence continues, the avoidant enters an interpretation crisis. They're desperately trying to understand what your silence means, and their mind cycles through increasingly anxious explanations. Initially, they tell themselves, "You're just busy. You'll reach out when you have time." This explanation works for a few days, maybe a week. But as the silence extends, this interpretation becomes untenable. No one is that busy. Something else is happening. The next interpretation is that you're playing games. You're trying to make them jealous or worried. You're using their own tactics against them. This explanation is more comfortable because it means you still care enough to strategize. It means the avoidance still has power because you're thinking about them, trying to manipulate them. But even this interpretation starts to feel hollow as your silence remains consistent. If you were playing games, there would be cracks in the facade. There would be subtle attempts to check if they're noticing. But your silence is too complete, too authentic to be strategic. Then the avoidant arrives at the interpretation that terrifies them. You've moved on. You've decided they're not worth the effort. You've recognized their patterns and chosen not to participate. You've found someone else or simply decided you're better off alone. This interpretation triggers full-scale panic because it means the avoidant has lost something they took for granted. It means their usual pattern of leaving and returning whenever they want has finally been disrupted by someone refusing to wait for their return. The interpretation crisis is exhausting for the avoidant. They obsessively analyze your last interactions, looking for clues about what your silence means. They replay conversations, reread old messages, scrutinize every detail for signs they missed that you were done with them. This analysis is ironic because the avoidant usually prides themselves on being rational and unemotional about relationships. But your silence has activated an anxiety they usually reserve for others. They're now the anxious one, the uncertain one, the one desperately trying to make sense of someone else's behavior. The avoidant also struggles with the fact that your silence gives them nothing to work with. When someone is angry or hurt, the avoidant can dismiss those emotions as overreactions. When someone is pursuing them, the avoidant can feel secure in their desirability. But silence is neutral. It doesn't provide ammunition for their defensive strategies. They can't tell themselves you're being dramatic or needy or clingy. You're just gone. And that absence is more destabilizing than any emotional outburst could be. The ego destruction. Your silence is systematically destroying the avoidant's ego in ways they never anticipated. Their ego is built on specific beliefs. They're the independent one, the desired one, the one who has options and makes others wait. They're the prize that people compete for. They're the one who maintains power through distance. Every one of these beliefs is being challenged by your continued absence. If you're not pursuing them, are they actually desirable? If you're not fighting for them, are they actually the prize? If you're not affected by their distance, does their withdrawal actually have power? These questions strike at the core of how the avoidant sees themselves. They've constructed an identity around being the person who doesn't need anyone, who is wanted but never wants back with equal intensity, who controls relationships through strategic absence. Your silence suggests that this identity might be fiction. You're not playing the role that would confirm their self-image. You're not providing the validation they unconsciously relied on. The ego destruction becomes particularly acute when the avoidant considers the possibility that you're thriving without them. Maybe you're happy. Maybe your life is better without their inconsistency and emotional unavailability. Maybe you've realized that their presence added stress rather than value. These thoughts are intolerable to the avoidance ego. They need to believe that they're irreplaceable, that their absence creates a void in others' lives, that people are diminished without them. Your silence, especially if it seems unbothered and complete, suggests the opposite. It suggests you're fine. And if you're fine without them, what does that say about their importance? The avoidant also faces ego destruction around their judgment of you. They thought they had you pegged. They thought they knew how you would react, what you would tolerate, where your breaking point was. Your silence proves they were wrong. They misjudged you completely. This realization is humbling in a way the avoidant rarely experiences. They pride themselves on reading people accurately, on understanding psychology, on being perceptive about relationship dynamics. But they completely missed that you were capable of this level of disengagement. Their perceptiveness, something they considered a strength, has been revealed as limited or flawed. The destruction of ego also involves confronting their own behavior. When you were pursuing them, the avoidant could tell themselves that their withdrawal was justified, that you were too clingy, that they needed space from your intensity. But your silence removes that justification. You're not being clingy, you're not being intense, you're just gone. This forces the avoidant to consider that maybe the problem was never you. Maybe their withdrawal wasn't a response to your behavior, but a manifestation of their own fear and dysfunction. This level of self-awareness is painful, and the avoidant will resist it as long as possible, but your silence keeps pushing them toward it, the desperation they denied. The avoidant is now experiencing a desperation they've spent their entire life denying could exist within them. They're checking their phone constantly, hoping for a message from you. They're looking at your social media, trying to glean any information about your emotional state. They're replaying memories of your time together, wondering if they can ever get that back. They're imagining scenarios where you reconnect, rehearsing what they would say, how they would explain their behavior. This is the exact desperation they've judged in others, the neediness they've run from, the attachment they've convinced themselves they're above. The desperation manifests as obsessive thinking. You occupy their mind in ways they never allowed you to when you were together. When you were available and trying to get close, the avoidant could dismiss you, minimize your importance, tell themselves you were just one option among many. But now that you're unavailable, now that you've removed yourself from their reach, you've become the only thing they can think about. The avoidant is discovering the cruel irony of their attachment style. They only fully feel their desire for someone when that person becomes unavailable. This desperation also involves physical symptoms the avoidant isn't used to experiencing. They might have trouble sleeping because their mind won't stop spinning scenarios about why you went silent. They might feel anxious in a way that manifests as chest tightness or stomach discomfort. They might find it hard to concentrate on work or other activities because thoughts of you keep intruding. The avoidant has always prided themselves on their emotional control, their ability to compartmentalize, their capacity to remain unaffected. But your silence has broken through all those defenses and activated a raw, visceral longing they can't intellectualize away. The desperation is particularly painful because the avoidant has no one to talk to about it. They've spent years cultivating an image of independence and emotional invulnerability. They can't suddenly admit to friends or family that they're devastated by your silence without revealing that everything they've presented about themselves was partially false. So they suffer alone, carrying this desperation in isolation, which only intensifies it. The avoidant is trapped in their own emotional prison, experiencing feelings they have no framework for processing and no support system for managing. The desperation also breeds temptation to reach out, but the avoidant remains paralyzed by competing fears. They're desperate to break the silence, to know where they stand, to have any contact with you at all. But they're also terrified of rejection, of appearing needy, of losing the last shred of pride they're clinging to. So they hover over their phone, typing and deleting messages, coming close to reaching out, but never quite able to push through the psychological barriers that hold them back. This internal battle is exhausting and adds another layer to their suffering. The narrative collapse. Every story the avoidant told themselves about the relationship is collapsing under the weight of your silence. They told themselves you needed them more than they needed you. Your silence disproves this. They told themselves they were doing you a favor by giving you any attention at all. Your silence suggests you don't see it that way. They told themselves they could leave and come back whenever they wanted because you would always be there. Your silence challenges that assumption. All the narratives that made them feel powerful and in control are revealed as fantasies that only worked because you played along. The narrative collapse is disorienting because the avoidant used these stories to make sense of their behavior. They weren't being emotionally unavailable and hurtful. They were protecting themselves from someone too needy. They weren't running from intimacy. They were maintaining healthy boundaries with someone too intense. They weren't afraid of commitment. They were being realistic about incompatibility. These narratives allowed them to avoid responsibility for their patterns and the pain those patterns caused. But your silence doesn't fit into any of these stories. You're not being needy by pursuing them. You're not being intense by demanding their attention. You're just absent. And absence can't be twisted into justification for their withdrawal. The avoidant is forced to construct new narratives to explain your silence, and none of them are flattering to their ego. Maybe you realized you were too good for them. Maybe you found someone who could actually meet your needs. Maybe you simply got tired of their games and decided you deserved better. These narratives require the avoidant to see themselves as the problem, as the one who lost something valuable through their own dysfunction. This perspective is the opposite of how they usually frame relationship endings. Usually they're the ones who left because the other person was flawed. Now they're confronting the possibility that you left because they were. The collapse of their narratives also means the avoidant can't predict what happens next. When they operated from their old stories, they knew how things would unfold. They would pull away, you would pursue, they would return when ready, and the cycle would continue until they decided to end it. But your silence has broken the cycle, and they have no template for what comes after. This uncertainty is deeply uncomfortable for someone who needs control and predictability to feel safe. The avoidant is in uncharted territory, and their usual coping mechanisms aren't working. The realization of loss. As days turn into weeks, the avoidant begins to truly realize what they've lost. Not the idealized version of you they created in their mind, but the actual person you were and what you brought to their life. They remember how you made them laugh, how you understood them in ways others didn't, how you accepted their flaws while still challenging them to be better. They recall the specific moments of connection that felt real and rare. They recognize that what they had with you wasn't something they can easily find again, no matter how much they tried to convince themselves otherwise. This realization is accompanied by profound regret. The avoidant sees clearly now how their fear sabotaged something genuine. They understand that their patterns of withdrawal and inconsistency wore down your willingness to stay. They recognize that they took your patience and understanding for granted, assuming it would always be available no matter how poorly they treated you. The regret is sharp and persistent, especially because the avoidant knows they created this situation. You didn't leave because of who you are. You left because of who they are and how they behaved. The realization of loss also involves acknowledging that they might not get another chance. Your silence suggests a finality that the avoidant never intended to create. They thought they could always come back, that the door would always be open, that you would always be willing to try again. But your complete absence indicates that the door might be closed, that you've moved past the point of being willing to engage with their dysfunction. This possibility terrifies them because it means they might have to live with the consequences of their fear-based choices, something the avoidant has always managed to avoid by cycling through relationships without real accountability. The loss feels particularly acute because the avoidant is finally experiencing the emotions they should have felt when you were together. When you were available, they couldn't let themselves feel how much you mattered. The vulnerability of caring felt too dangerous. But now that you're gone, now that the threat of intimacy has been removed by your absence, they can finally feel everything. The love they couldn't express, the need they couldn't admit, the fear of losing you they couldn't acknowledge. All of it surfaces now, when it's too late to matter. The transformation moment. Your silence has created a pivotal moment for the avoidant. They're standing at a crossroads where they have to make a choice about who they want to be. They can continue down the familiar path of avoidance, telling themselves your silence proves relationships aren't worth the effort, that people are unreliable, that their fear-based approach to intimacy was correct all along. This path maintains their ego and their patterns, but guarantees continued loneliness and emotional stagnation. Or they can use this moment as a catalyst for genuine transformation. They can acknowledge that their avoidance cost them something valuable. They can recognize that their fear of vulnerability created the exact abandonment they've always feared. They can commit to doing the difficult work of understanding and changing their attachment patterns. This path requires humility, courage, and sustained effort, but it offers the possibility of healthier relationships and deeper connection in the future. The transformation moment is brutal because it requires the avoidant to face truths about themselves they've spent decades avoiding. They have to admit they're afraid, that they're wounded, that they're not as independent and emotionally superior as they've pretended to be. They have to acknowledge that their dismissive approach to relationships has been a defense mechanism, not a sign of enlightenment. They have to recognize that needing people isn't weakness, and that vulnerability isn't dangerous in the way their childhood experiences taught them it was. Your silence has also given the avoidant something they rarely experience: consequences. Usually they can withdraw without real repercussions because people keep coming back, keep tolerating their inconsistency, keep accepting breadcrumbs. But you've imposed a consequence. You've removed yourself. You've demonstrated that their behavior has a cost, and that cost is losing access to you. This consequence is the most powerful teacher the avoidant could have, more effective than any conversation or confrontation would be. Whether the avoidant uses this moment to genuinely transform or simply to reinforce their existing defenses remains to be seen. But what's certain is that your silence has created an opportunity for growth that pursuing them never could. By refusing to beg, by refusing to chase, by refusing to participate in the dysfunctional pattern they tried to establish, you've forced them to confront themselves. You've held up a mirror that shows them the reality of their patterns and the consequences of their choices. And regardless of whether they ultimately do the work to change, you've done something crucial for yourself. You've demonstrated that you value your own dignity and well-being more than you value a relationship with someone who can't show up for you. That self-respect, that boundary, that refusal to diminish yourself for someone else's comfort, that's the real transformation. And it's yours to keep no matter what the avoidant does with the wake-up call you've given them.